Hello, Little Rock School District. My name is Shandell Carpenter, and I am the dyslexia specialist for the district. I have been teaching special education for the last 11 years, and I have taught dyslexia intervention for about 4. And I'm excited to be able to deliver a Dyslexia Awareness PLC to you today. The first thing that we want to talk about are some of the myths that surround dyslexia and then the actual reality. People think that dyslexia is rare. Dyslexia impacts anywhere between 5 to 17% of the population. That number varies depending on the study and depending on the language that children speak. Languages like Italian and Spanish are easier to decode because they have what's called a shallow orthography, and one letter typically represents one sound. English is one of the harder languages to master because we have sight words that don't follow phonetic patterns, and we've borrowed words from the Greek language, the Latin language, the French language, and depending on where that word originated, we pronounce it differently. One of the biggest myths surrounding dyslexia is that it's a visual problem. A lot of time we have teachers say that they think that kids with dyslexia see things backwards, like B's and P's and Q's, or they might see a word as with the last letter first or the first letter last, but actually it's not a visual problem at all. It is a problem with the ability to manipulate language. So that is one of the big myths surrounding dyslexia. Down here, reversals are a core feature of dyslexia. Reversals in older kids can be an indicator that a student might be showing characteristics of dyslexia, but actually all people who have low literacy typically reverse things. And it's also completely normal for children to do reversals until about the age of 7. So whatever, it doesn't matter how I hold this, it is still a highlighter, right? So when I turn it this way, it doesn't become a completely different thing. When I turn it this way, it doesn't become a completely different thing. But then for kids, we tell them that this is a D, and you turn it around. I'm trying to see on your screen, I think that would be a Q, and a P, and a D. That's really confusing for little guys. They are not used to turning something in a different direction and having it become a completely new thing. So it's totally normal for a child to reverse until about the end of 7 years old. One of the most harmful myths that we have is that dyslexia is outgrown. Research tells us that children in kindergarten who have problems with phonological awareness can be remediated in about 30 minutes a day. But if we wait until 4th grade, it takes about 2 hours a day to remediate that child. So when we say things like, oh, she's fine, she just needs to catch up, or let's give her more time, that is where we end up wasting our time and the child's time, because it's something that will not just correct itself without explicit instruction. So we need to intervene quickly. Dyslexia cannot be diagnosed until 3rd grade. Actually, we've got a lot of indicators that can tell us that a child has characteristics of dyslexia as early as 5 years old. When children have trouble rhyming, when children have trouble identifying the beginning sound that's the same, like ball and bat, being able to say, oh, both those words start with B. Children who mispronounce words that they should know past a particular age, so confusing the word tornado and volcano. Those are all signs that can let us know that a child could possibly have characteristics of dyslexia. Another big sign is that they've already had a year of pre-K and they still don't know their letters by the end of kindergarten. They're going to have trouble memorizing those sequences. One of the other myths is that dyslexia is a medical diagnosis. Dyslexia is an educational determination that we make by assessing a child's reading, spelling, and phonological awareness abilities. So you don't have to have a diagnosis of dyslexia to receive intervention. Our law says that a child has to show characteristics of dyslexia. They need to show that it has its root is a phonological problem, and that it is unexpected in relation to that child's ability level. Some of the other interesting myths. Gifted individuals cannot be dyslexic. There are a lot of really exceptional people who have dyslexia. Usually kids with dyslexia are creative and they're good at building things and they think outside of the box. So the current reality in Arkansas is alarming. About 32% of our fourth grade students are proficient in reading. That's from 2017. And as we get into the higher grades, the percentage drops to 29% because reading gets harder, but we have stopped decoding instruction. And so kids don't just absorb this information and all of a sudden get better at reading. We have to explicitly teach them how to read. 40% of our 3rd through 10th grade students are proficient in reading overall. And 35% of the kids who walk across the stage are proficient in reading. These are not the kids who drop out. These are not the kids who couldn't cut it. These are the kids who actually earned a diploma and they are not on grade level. We need to think about too, you know, if we've got 35% of our students graduating on grade level, how are we utilizing response to intervention? Are we an upside down triangle? Do we have where only 35% of our kids don't need tier 2 and tier 3 and everybody else does? It should really be flopped around where about, you know, 15% of our kids need intense reading instruction and 80% of our kids should be okay with tier 1, but we need to look at our core instruction if we're seeing numbers like this. And I'm excited because we've adopted a really great program that has 30 years of research behind it for improving reading instruction with Wilson. People estimate that dyslexia can impact about 1 out of every 5 people, so it's fairly common. As I said before, about 1 in 5 people worldwide have dyslexia, and kids who are labeled with a learning disability or SLD and special education as reading, word reading, basic reading, reading fluency, about 85% of those students, we could go ahead and say they have a diagnosis of dyslexia. If you look in a child's IEP folder and you see that the child has specific learning disability in basic reading or reading fluency, that means that we've already decided that there is a disconnect between what the child is capable of doing and where they are in reading, and that is part of the definition. Another really interesting thing to remember is that dyslexia is genetic. It does run in families. So it's really important for us to do that family history, check that parent interview, because if we've got a student in our classroom who is struggling to read and their parent also struggled to read, it's a much higher chance that this child has characteristics of dyslexia, that it's not just misinstruction. Dyslexia is a neurobiological brain difference that affects people's ability to manipulate language. When we look at functional MRIs of children with characteristics of dyslexia's brain, we see that the right side of their brain is lighting up as opposed to the left side. They are overcompensating with the right side of their brain to read. This side is not as efficient as the left side. The left side is automatic and it's logical. And so they're overworking, they're taking the long road to get to that word. Dyslexia doesn't ever go away, but people with dyslexia can learn to read if they are taught with structured literacy, which helps actually rewire their brain. Like I said before, we can take a functional MRI of a child with dyslexia before intense intervention and notice that their brain's mostly lighting up on the right. After this kind of intervention, we can actually see that the brain is rewiring. We can see the left side lighting up more and the child becomes more quickly at identifying words automatically. People with dyslexia often have low self-esteem because they feel stupid and they struggle in school and are teased. Our society likes to equate a reading ability with intelligence, but that is not the case. Kids with dyslexia, people with dyslexia, have a typical IQ or an above average IQ, and they have one area of weakness. This decoding area is weak, but that doesn't mean that they're not smart. A lot of them are extremely smart and gifted. Dyslexia does not impact IQ. It doesn't impact your ability to learn. It doesn't impact your ability to think. It only impacts your ability to decode words and spell words and read fluently. It's a lot I like to say it's kind of like someone who needs glasses. Having a vision issue does not mean you can't think, but it might make it harder for you to read words without glasses. So I think we kind of need to think about it. Even though it's invisible, it's still something that really does impact these kids. And it doesn't mean they're not trying. It doesn't mean they're lazy. They just have a difference in their brain that we need to figure out the best way to correct. Okay, why does it matter? These are some startling statistics that we have. About 85% of youth in juvenile detention have disabilities, but only 37% had services for those disabilities when they were in school. There was a big study in Texas that found that 80% of prison inmates were functionally illiterate. It is very hard to be successful in this world if you do not have the ability to read. ATM's instructions are written on a 10th grade level. Trade manual instructions are written on a 10th grade level. It is almost impossible to be successful without being able to read. Students with learning disabilities like dyslexia have a 3 times higher risk of attempting suicide. And 89% of suicide notes have dyslexic type spellings in them. This isn't just about reading, it's about quality of life, and it's about well-being. And I think that we need to consider that when we think about these kids.
Here is a clip of sculptor Willard Wiggin describing his experience with dyslexia in school.
Here's some chalk. Here's the blackboard. Write your name. So I drew a picture of a little man, which was me. So the kids started to chuckle. I could hear them laughing. That's not your name. Write your name. So I just got the chalk and made some, like, just a circle and then another circle and then drew a dog, which was my dog, and drew whatever. Because I don't have no experience of writing, so that was it. And then she said to me, children, here we have an exhibition of failure. E is failure. This is what not to become. The reason why the word failure was written in the dictionary was because of Willard. Willard is failure. When she told me that, I said to myself then, even though I was only a child, I realized what she said. So because she said I was that, she destroyed me. So I was destroyed. So that was it. Destroyed academically. Obliterated. That is it. I became a bit of a recluse. I locked myself away. A lot. You know, disappeared like Howard Hughes, you know, and just stayed there working. And I did a carving of Miss Havisham on a toothpick, on the point. And the first thing my mother said to me was, that is beautiful. That is very, very nice. That is incredible. My artwork becomes a defense. So I'm going to be the greatest. I am going to be the greatest in my head.
So there are some laws in Arkansas specific to us that we need to follow. And the big one that applies to teachers and administrators is 1268. It's a revision of 1294 from 2013. There are several components to this law, but I'm going to give you more of a breakdown on this slide here. So Act 1268 requires screening and response to intervention for students displaying characteristics of dyslexia. So we have to do an initial screener for every child in K through 2. That is in Little Rock right now. We use DIBBLS, the rapid naming assessment, and the monster spelling test. This is not a diagnostic test. This is a test that predicts risk. So we do this for all of our K through 2 kids because, like I said before, if we catch this early, we can remediate it more efficiently and prevent more failure down the road. If a child on that K through 2 screening has one area, only one, that is at risk or some risk, we need to do a level 1 or a level 2 dyslexia screening. And those screenings are diagnostic. So I like to think of the universal screener like when you go to the emergency room. The first thing they're going to do is take your temperature and your heart rate and your blood pressure, because they need to know who needs help immediately, and then they will send you back to the doctor to get that diagnostic to figure out what's wrong. The universal screener doesn't tell us what is wrong, but it does tell us that this child is at risk. That level 1 narrows it down and tells us exactly what's going on with that child and what we need to do to remediate it. Once we have done a level 1 screener, that can be done by anyone who's trained. Level 2 screeners, right now in Little Rock, we use our school psychologist, and that could qualify a child for 504 or IDEA. But once we do that initial screener, when we find a risk area, we want to notify the parent of the results, and we want to ask them some questions. What I talked about earlier, the survey to figure out some family history. After that, we would have a meeting, whether that is SBIT, 504, or IEP, to answer 3 questions that I will show you later to determine if the child should be considered to be exhibiting the characteristics of dyslexia. And if the team decides that child is exhibiting characteristics, he or she needs to be provided systematic phonics instruction that's multisensory and evidence-based. And we're going to talk about that later too. Children in 504 IDEA are not exempt from screening, nor are they exempt from intervention. And also the dyslexia awareness piece, which is what we're doing right now. Everybody needs to be aware for what to look for so that we can properly identify students. So here is the definition that our law uses, and I'm going to read it quickly and then we're going to break it down into pieces. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin and is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, or spelling, and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit phonological component of language that's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So that's the definition. Let's break it down.
Take a moment to read the following. How was that? Frustrating? Slow? What were those sentences about? They're actually a simulation of the experience of dyslexia, designed to make you decode each word. Those with dyslexia experience that laborious pace every time they read. When most people think of dyslexia, they think of seeing letters and words backwards, like seeing B as D and vice versa. Or they might think people with dyslexia see saw as was. The truth is, people with dyslexia see things the same way as everyone else. Dyslexia is caused by a phonological processing problem, meaning people affected by it have trouble not with seeing language, but with manipulating it. For example, if you heard the word cat and then someone asked you, remove the C, what word would you have left? At. This can be difficult for those with dyslexia. Given a word in isolation like fantastic, students with dyslexia need to break the word into parts to read it. Fan, tas, tick. Time spent decoding makes it hard to keep up with peers and gain sufficient comprehension. Spelling words phonetically like STIK for stick and FRENS for friends is also common. These difficulties are more widespread and varied than commonly imagined. Dyslexia affects up to 1 in 5 people. It occurs on a continuum. One person might have mild dyslexia, while the next person has a profound case of it. Dyslexia also runs in families. It's common to see one family member who has trouble spelling, while another family member has severe difficulty decoding even one-syllable words like catch. The continuum and distribution of dyslexia suggest a broader principle to bear in mind as we look at how the brains of those with dyslexia process language. Neurodiversity is the idea that because all our brains show differences in structure and function, we shouldn't be so quick to label every deviation from the norm as a pathological disorder, or dismiss people living with these variations as defective. People with neurobiological variations like dyslexia, including such creative and inventive individuals as Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, and Cher, clearly have every capacity to be brilliant and successful in life. So here's the special way the brains of those with dyslexia work. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is generally in charge of language and ultimately reading, while the right typically handles spatial activities. fMRI studies have found that the brains of those with dyslexia rely more on the right hemisphere and frontal lobe than the brains of those without it. This means when they read a word, it takes a longer trip through their brain and can get delayed in the frontal lobe. Because of this neurobiological glitch, they read with more difficulty. But those with dyslexia can physically change their brain and improve their reading. With an intensive multisensory intervention that breaks the language down and teaches the reader to decode based on syllable types and spelling rules, the brains of those with dyslexia begin using the left hemisphere more efficiently while reading, and their reading improves. The intervention works because it locates dyslexia appropriately, as a functional variation in the brain, which naturally shows all sorts of variations from one person to another. Neurodiversity emphasizes this spectrum of brain function in all humans, and suggests that to better understand the perspectives of those around us, we should try to not only see the world through their eyes, but understand it through their brains.
So let's break this definition down. Neurological in origin. So what does that mean? Here are the brain scans we were talking about. A typical reader is going to show in a functional MRI while reading a lot of activity over here on the left hemisphere and a little activity on the right. A child that is not capable of reading is only going to light up in the back. They don't have skills happening on either side. But a capable child with dyslexia, this is a child who has compensated and is struggling, is going to show much more activity on the right side and much less activity on the left side. And so they're taking the long back road to get to that word. And that can be frustrating and impact comprehension, as we saw in that video. Characterized by difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. These are not your kids that have great reading skills and can decode everything, but don't understand it. These are your kids that understand what you read to them, but have a breakdown when it comes to reading and spelling. Kids with dyslexia, characteristics of dyslexia, are going to do better if they are reading from a passage because they're going to be compensating with those context clues. If you give them a list of words, they're going to really struggle because they don't have the context to figure out that word. Nonsense words. A lot of people struggle with nonsense words. To a kindergartner, every word is a nonsense word. And to a child that's learning new words, any new word is a nonsense word. So if a child is able to decode a word they've never seen before, that's the same thing as being able to decode a nonsense word. So sometimes we'll have kids that do really well on those leveled text with the pictures because they're overcompensating, and it's predictive. It will say, I touch my head, I touch my shoulders, I touch my knees. That child can read that book without even looking at it typically. But when we give them a 3-letter nonsense word like N-O-P, NOP, they can't read it. That is a big indicator that either we haven't taught that child the skills that they need to learn new words without picture support, or that the child might have characteristics of dyslexia because they are not able to read by decoding. They are reading by memorization. Another problem you're going to see is word identification over here. So a lot of times my students will read these words and I'll get the same answers because they're going to say a word that they know they've memorized that's more common. Like instead of sundry, almost, I guarantee you, if I gave this to my high school kids, almost every kid's going to say Sunday, because sundry is not a word they've seen typically, and Sunday is a word they see all the time. And so a lot of times they'll get the first sound right, but they'll mess up the ending. Domino, maybe here, important. Things like that are going to happen because they don't look at the whole word. They're not able to decode that way. They've read by memorizing or guessing. Looking at spelling errors can be very informative for teachers. So I recommend that anyone who gives a spelling test for a student that they might, or for any student really, that we need to look at the errors that the child is making. I recommend that you give them a pin so you can see if the student is automatically processing or if they're taking longer to figure that word out. So we've got a couple of different kinds of errors that students will make. Students with dyslexia will typically make a lot of phonological errors. So that is when a student does not have all of the sounds represented in that word. They might omit a sound, they might add a sound, and they might confuse sounds or sound order. So for example, we have some phonological errors here. Right here, we have T-L-A-L-L. So this is where a student would have confused the sound order. He hears tall, but he can't tell if there's an L there or not. He's kind of just inserted it in. Another phonological error right here, began. He's left the vowel out. He's left out that A. Windy. He's left out the N right here, and he's used a silent E to represent a long E. And so the E part would be orthographic because he's used a E to represent that sound E, but the leaving out of the N is an omission. That's a phonological error. Orthographic errors are when the student has had some instruction and they use the wrong spelling, but it is represented by a grapheme. So this is a real word, be, but in the sentence, the word be was used as a verb. And so this would be considered an orthographic error because he spelled it a way that would say be, but it wasn't the correct be. Right here, we have colds. He probably had trouble hearing that L. And so it looks like he inserted it later. Code, cold. Code, cold. It's very close. And so it's a blend, it's quickly said, and sometimes we can miss those L's and R's. The other thing we have is this is what I would call a unit, old. It doesn't make the right sound. Typically in a closed syllable, O is gonna say ah. And so he's added a silent E onto the end. Maybe he thinks that's gonna change the sound. Number 14 is a lot of what our students with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia do. They will write a word that they can spell that means the same thing. So a lot of times you will see that their writing doesn't represent their vocabulary. So this kiddo wrote mom when the word was mother, and then he thought, you know, I can spell mom, but it's a spelling test. I probably better write what I hear. And so you can see that he tried mutter, and then he put a TH in there. Like, I know that it's there. I don't know where it goes. I'm not sure what sound it makes. We've got an orthographic error here, night. That is how you could pronounce night. That would jump over that T and make that I long, but the way that we spell night in English is right here. Number 16 is really interesting because this child, the word is page. And so you can see it at the beginning, he spelled it B-A-C-H, bach, page, page. Those sounds are extremely close together. So if you say B, it's voiced, you can feel it in your throat. But if you say P, you do the exact same thing with your mouth, but it's unvoiced. B, P, B, P. You're doing the same thing. It's hard for him to hear. The exact same thing with ch and j, ch, j, ch, j. If you look at my mouth, you can't tell which one I'm doing. And he can't differentiate if you're saying a j or a ch. Then he went back and he added a j on the end. He's like, I hear it. I just don't know. It's at the end, but I also hear ch. And I don't know if you know this rule, but in English, we don't end words with J. We'll do a GE instead. And then he finally settled on PAG, which would be PAG. So you can see here that this is not an automatic process. He is still struggling with phonological awareness. And so I think that when we look at those errors, we can really say, hey, I think we need to maybe get this kid screened. I think this child might be showing characteristics of dyslexia. Your students with characteristics of dyslexia are going to fall right here. Dyslexia is not the only type of reading difficulty. Kids that have good language comprehension, they understand what you say to them and what you read to them. Typically, their vocabulary is much better than what you're seeing in their writing. They don't want to read aloud. They have trouble spelling. So the kids with good language comprehension and poor word reading are our kids up here that we would label as characteristics of dyslexia. Kids that have poor language and poor word reading, they've got a mixed bag. They're going to need more support on both sides. Kids with hyperlexia, a lot of times our students on the autism spectrum will be hyperlexic, and that is when they can decode everything, but they don't understand it. I had someone explain this to me once by saying that they could read something in Spanish very accurately, but if asked to then summarize what they had read in Spanish, they wouldn't know what to do. And that's a lot of times what's happening with our students, with our EL students who are good at decoding and with our students with autism. Skilled readers have both good language comprehension and good word reading. The third part of our definition, a deficit in the phonological component of language. This is critical. Okay, so phonological awareness is the awareness of the sound structure of language. This is the overarching ability to differentiate between syllables, words, onset, and rhyme. This is where we have a breakdown in students with characteristics of dyslexia. We assess this. One of the assessments that we use in Little Rock is the Phonological Awareness Screening Test in David Kilpatrick's book, Equipped for Reading Success. And so we will say things like, say baseball without the ball. And the student should say base, and they should say it quickly, because this is something they should master by pre-K and definitely by kindergarten. Being able to hear how many syllables are in a word. This is critical. If a student is not able to do these lower level skills, they're going to struggle with reading and they will not be successful with phonics instruction. This is also something we need to remember that is done without print. Phonological awareness can be done in the dark, people say, because it's all about hearing. You're reading this on the screen, but the student doesn't see that. We're saying it to them and having them hear it automatically. Phonemic awareness is the #1 predictor of reading success. Students with characteristics of dyslexia almost always have a phonemic awareness problem. So they are not able to differentiate the individual phonemes in a word or take individual phonemes and blend them together to create a word. So we demonstrate this skill by taking spoken sounds like k, a, t, and being able to blend those together to form the word cat. We also can segment sounds, segment whole words into their sounds. So p, I, n, pine. When students automatically are able to identify the individual sounds in spoken words and take individual sounds and blend them together, and then eventually manipulate those sounds, we see increased reading growth. It's the #1 predictor that a child will be successful with reading, is if they automatically have this. And I think that we threw the phonics baby out with the bathwater when it didn't work with some of our students, and it's because they didn't have phonemic awareness. If they do not have phonemic awareness, they will not be successful with phonics because they are not capable of hearing the individual pieces of sounds in a word. We can successfully remediate this easily by just training the brain to make that pathway. So when I say manipulating, I'm talking about activities like say guide, now say guide, but change the g to a r, ride. We want students to be able to do that in 2 seconds or less, because that means that they're automatically able to hear that. And if they can't hear that piece, they won't be able to hear it, remember what letter makes that sound, remember how to form that letter, and put it in the correct order. And that's going to impact all of the instruction that we're doing for phonics later on. So here's a great explanation of the phonological awareness continuum. And if you've been through RISE training, you probably know this, but just a quick overview. Students who are at the phonological awareness levels where they can rhyme, where they're still struggling with rhyme, where they're struggling with hearing initial and final sounds, or where they're struggling with hearing syllables, will not be successful with phonics instruction. Until a child hits this phonemic awareness level of phonological awareness, he or she will not be able to apply phonics, because phonics is based on individual sounds. And so if we're giving the pass, our kids at D&E, this has to be corrected and automatic before we can start really applying the phonics instruction that we use in our classrooms. When kids get to F and G on the pass, the onset and rhyme, being able to do that activity earlier, the guide, g-ide, r-ide, that's when we can start applying phonics instruction and seeing success. But the biggest bang for our buck is up here, this manipulation, being able to segment a word into sounds. Because if you hear a word, began, and you're able to take that word and break it down, b, e, g, a, n, you're going to be able to spell it. And that's what we call orthographic mapping. And that's when kids are automatic here, they're able to read quickly. The last part of our definition is that this reading and spelling problem is typically unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So we probably don't have an IQ test, and that's okay. We're going to be able to tell as a teacher who is operating on a typical cognitive ability and who isn't. Thinking, reasoning, and understanding are not impacted by dyslexia. Word reading and spelling are. What can we do? We can look at their other cognitive abilities. Is the child able to understand what's read to them? Is the child able to tell you and express something that happened to them but not write it on paper? Does the student have a good vocabulary? If we don't have an IQ test, we can also look and see like if their math ability is higher than their reading ability, because that means the capacity is there for that learning, but there's a breakdown happening at the reading level. Effective instruction. Effective instruction, we need to have a systematic, cumulative, sequential, multisensory, evidence-based, not research-based, evidence-based program to teach students how to read. Our kids with dyslexia are the hardest kids to teach decoding to. If we can teach every student the way that we teach those kids, we're going to hit every other kid on the way down. Research tells us that guided reading is not effective for these kids. Balanced literacy is not effective for these kids. In fact, guided reading whole language is probably the most studied practice for reading, and it comes out dead last every time because it is the control in all of our phonics studies. Kids that have phonological awareness and phonemic awareness are much more successful when given systematic phonics instruction than when they're given a whole word approach. Those do not work for these kids. Please do not waste their time and your time trying to correct these reading difficulties with practices that are not evidence-based. We really need to utilize RTI, because I like to think of RTI as it's building. It's not one or the other. If we teach every single kid to read words the way that we teach a student who has characteristics of dyslexia to read, we're going to reach more kids in tier 1. Some students only need one tier to reach that reading apple. Some kids are going to need targeted tier 2 instruction, and it needs to be focused on where they are weak. Kids are only as strong as their weakest area. These kids need a double dose of evidence-based reading instruction to reach the reading apple. Our kids with characteristics of dyslexia, they're here. They need whole group structured literacy. They need small group targeted skills, and then they need additional small group in dyslexia intervention to reach the reading apple. This is probably going to be about 15% of kids that are going to need all three. It's not, you're only going to go with the reading teacher and I'm going to teach reading to the rest of the class. This kid needs double, triple doses. We don't do one or the other. Here are brain scans of a kindergartner before systematic phonics instruction. The child is mostly reading with their right brain. The right brain is lighting up a lot more than their left brain. After given systematic phonics instruction, multisensory intervention, areas of the brain are lighting up that weren't lighting up before. These are the quick areas, the automatic areas. So this is not just my opinion. This is neurology. This instruction changes brains and improves brain activity on the left side of the brain to improve reading. This is a really great slide, and if you have time, I'd recommend watching some of these. It's a little cheesy. It's a video from the 80s, trying to simulate what it feels like sometimes to have a learning disability, because it's sometimes hard for us to understand when we haven't had that difficulty what that would be like. I think this is a good time. This is a simulation. I want you to attempt to read this text. And even though reversals are not the cause of dyslexia, sometimes that can be difficult for our students. So B, D, P, and Q might be reversed in any of these words. When you read this, I want you to see what it feels like and note what it sounds like, because this is typically what our students with dyslexia, they're experiencing this type of reading difficulty when they are asked to read. What does dyslexia look like in the classroom? Students with dyslexia, as we talked about earlier, have self-esteem and anxiety issues, and that's definitely going to manifest in different ways. In elementary, we're going to have kids who have difficulty remembering simple sequences, counting to 20, the days of the week, inability to recite the alphabet after explicit instruction. These are warning signs. Difficulty understanding how words rhyme. My son will say, right here, right now, mommy, that rhymes. And we work on rhyming all the time. And so that is a warning sign. Trouble recognizing words that begin with the same sound, bird and baby. Noting, oh, those both start with the B sound. Those are signs in elementary that the student might need to be screened. Pronunciation difficulties, persistent and after they're normal. So saying tornado for volcano, not being able to pronounce certain words that other children that age are able to pronounce. My child will say reggery instead of regular. And it's cute at first, and then it's, well, we're not correcting that. Sometimes they'll have trouble clapping to rhythm, and they'll have difficulty with word retrieval. So adults are busy and stressed, and our brains aren't as young and working in tip-top shape as our little guys. And little kids shouldn't forget the names of objects, and they'll say, I need, what's that? The thing that you write with. That's a sign that that child might have characteristics of dyslexia. We might need to screen the kiddo. Oh, the last one, trouble remembering names of places, people, and difficulty remembering spoken directions. Those can be signs that we might need to screen.
So what do we look for, right? So what do we look for in secondary students? Our secondary students are typically going to be kids who have compensated. And they're going to be our students who have a good vocabulary typically, who understand what we read to them. But when we look at their writing samples and we hear them read, it's not what we would expect for that student. So sometimes our kids with characteristics of dyslexia are going to struggle with oral language. They're going to struggle with coming up with the correct word for something. They're going to have a hard time making a summary. And their listening vocabulary, they can understand what you say better than they can usually tell you what they know. And oftentimes our students with characteristics of dyslexia also struggle with organization, because ADHD and dyslexia have a high comorbidity rate. About between 30–40% of kids who have ADHD also have dyslexia. Kids who are in middle and high are going to try to hide their reading problems. They're going to say things like, can you read this to me? I forgot my glasses. Sometimes they will choose to get in trouble rather than have to be embarrassed by reading aloud. They're going to utilize others to read for them. they're going to go to the bathroom when it's their turn to read or present. These are also oftentimes going to be your kids who rely on memorization of things. They might not be able to take notes very well, but they're going to be able to tell you everything that you said in your lecture, because that is how they have had to survive. It's not that they're not listening. That's what they've got to do to make sure they've got the information. And also sometimes these students are not able to write. They might have dysgraphia. They might have very poor handwriting or do letter reversals as an older student. So one thing, I want to show you guys a quick clip of some students with dyslexia describing what it feels like to be a student in a classroom and struggle with reading.
It's hard to talk about not understanding something when you don't know why you're not, you know? Because I didn't know. I just thought I was dumb. I didn't realize that there was anything preventing me from understanding. And there were some things I was good at, so I was able to kind of hide it and compensate, you know?
Don't pick on me when it comes down to reading. And like, if they did pick on me to read, I'll find a way just to get out of it. Like, I'll be the smart one of the class to make everybody laugh so they could kick me out of class.
In 6th grade, I was suicidal, and that was pretty bad. I was admitted to a hospital for suicide watch for a couple weeks. I just gave up altogether, and I would stop doing all my work because I was so frustrated that I couldn't express how I was thinking onto paper or into tests, anything.
Accommodations and modifications. Students might need a ramp to access grade level material while we are remediating those encoding problems. So I know that kids have to have an IEP or a 504 plan to get those on state and national testing. And you can get a 504 and an IEP with, you can get a 504 plan with level 2 testing and outside diagnosis. And if the team decides the student needs that, that's what we need to go ahead and do. An IEP, the child needs to have an adverse effect, and we would need to do a comprehensive evaluation. But we don't have to have that to help some of our students in the classroom necessarily. While a child is learning how to read, we don't want to limit their access to all of the learning that is happening in our classrooms through reading and writing. We don't want to limit how they express to us their knowledge. So a person in a wheelchair could climb upstairs on their arms, but we wouldn't ask them to do that. They need a ramp to get to where they want to go. Our kids need a ramp sometimes to get that material, and that's okay. And sometimes remediation can almost virtually correct that. And sometimes we still are going to need those accommodations to be able to show us what you know and to be able to get that grade level material. But these are things that you might try. Audiobooks and text-to-speech software. There are links on lrsd.org/dyslexia to some of this free software. Using outlines and summaries, previewing questions and vocabulary before a story so they have a purpose for reading, and if you do it right, peer reading support. We don't want them to be self-conscious or embarrassed, but we want them to be able to help each other. For writing, when you are giving a report or a paper, not a spelling test, grading for what the content was rather than the spelling. We want to know what they learned, not what they can spell. Sometimes kids are going to need dictation to an adult or a computer. Sometimes students will do better if they can express how they learned a different way than a written report, because that's the one area that they struggle with. Speech-to-text software is available through Immersive Reader, Google Docs, reducing written work, minimizing copying. A lot of times our kids with dyslexia they're really good at listening. They have good listening comprehension, but if they have to focus all of their cognitive processes on forming the letters that are on the board, then that's taking up all of the space. They can't listen to what you're saying too. And so it can be helpful to occasionally, or it can be helpful for some kids to have a copy of the notes so that they can focus on listening and maybe they can highlight instead of writing what's on the board. And then a lot of times if we can accept an oral response or a presentation in lieu of written work. Testing, when we have a child who on an untimed test does a lot better than on a times test, that's a great indicator that that student will benefit from extended time. Even if we can remediate decoding issues, those students oftentimes are still going to need extra time to be able to decode that passage. And so we're just giving them the time that they need to decode. Reviewing directions orally, read aloud testing, and dictation. Homework, sometimes we've got a child and they're doing well, they're making really good grades. And then when we sit down with the child and the parent, we learn that they are spending 5 hours a night on homework just to do what the other kids are only taking an hour to do. That's when we need to say, this isn't reasonable for this kid. They can show us what they know without having to do that amount of work. Giving extra time and limiting time spent on homework can also be effective. For instruction, if we break tasks into small steps, directions, emphasize reviewing daily and providing a copy of notes. And then for our classrooms, about 40% of our kids with characteristics of dyslexia also have ADHD. And so if we can help them with organization by posting schedules, routines, helping them with color coding materials so they can be organized, help them with I've got a great link on our website of a binder. It's called a SOAR binder, and it can be really effective in helping our kids stay organized. Preferential seating, and please don't ask the kids to read aloud in front of everyone. My dad has dyslexia, and he still, I think, is very traumatized by being asked to read aloud on multiple occasions. And it's no fun to have that pressure when it's something you're not good at. Okay, so what do you do if you suspect a child in your classroom has characteristics of dyslexia? The first thing that you're going to do as a teacher is we have a teacher referral form. So you can go to this link, or it's on our website as well, and you can check the boxes for what you think you're seeing in that student. It can also be really helpful for you to submit a copy of some unedited writing or a spelling test. Those are great things for us to look at as a team. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's very, very effective. The next thing that we have is a parent interview. And as the classroom teacher, you know that parent, and we want you to let them know what you're seeing, or let them know the results of our initial screening if it's a K-2 student. And not to be alarming, but just let them know, we want to interview you because we do assessments in our classrooms and we notice some areas of risk that we want to dig deeper and see what's going on with your kiddo. And as a part of that, we want to interview you. So it can be helpful to help the parent complete this questionnaire. And so I have on here an option for them to leave their phone number and give it back to you with times that they're available to talk. This can be done over the phone. It can be done in person. Here's the form. It's the same questions that we had on the teacher checklist, except we've got things on here like if the parent had learning problems or if a sibling had learning problems, that can be really effective. And once this is complete, we will then proceed with the screening process. A level 1 screener can be done after this is done. And if we're doing a level 2, we're going to need to have the school psychologist do the informed consent paperwork for that. The screening packet that we use for level 1 is also linked here. And so the reading interventionists currently are the ones who are going to be administering that. Anyone who is trained can administer that. And next year we're going to have more intense training so that classroom teachers will be able to administer this and also utilize it so that they can figure out exactly where their students need to work. And it has all of the assessments that we use and the cut scores to determine if a child is at risk or some risk for each of those. And this is the level 1. This is not the initial that we give K-2. This is for any child in K through 12th grade that we need to see what's going on. If we think the child needs accommodations, modifications, and older students, we typically will recommend a level 2, which is done by the school psychologist. We also have flow charts on the website that help us determine what our next steps are. So if you've got a question, this, for example, is the K-2 flow chart for without an outside diagnosis. It has what we're supposed to do first, and then it gives you options. Does a child already have a diagnosis, yes or no? And then which step do you go to? And then it also has links in the document to some of the things that we've talked about, like the screener packet. Last, I have a Google Drive that I have set up that includes articles, instructional support, videos, things like that that you can access. And the link is right here. And so anyone in Little Rock School District can access that and get some help with the Google Drive. Also, here's our website. I've got links to videos, support assistive technology, videos about dyslexia, and all of the forms that we utilize. The other people that you can contact, your literacy facilitator is a great resource. He or she is going to be able to answer some of your questions. Your reading teacher, dyslexia interventionist can also help. Your special education staff is very knowledgeable. And finally, you can always contact me. I am the only dyslexia specialist for all of the schools in Little Rock School District, but I will be sure to get back with you as soon as I can, and my contact information is here. Thank you for participating in this dyslexia awareness training and this webinar. And let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.